안녕하세요. 반갑습니다. 본목인
Good
지평
morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I am Taek Lim, Managing Partner at JIPYONG LLC. JIPYONG LLC and BSR signed an MOU on cooperation, and as a first event commemorating our partnership, we've organized this webinar on the topic of supply chain sustainability and human rights due diligence in business and human rights. As you understand, supply chain issues are receiving a lot of attention in Korea, and especially human rights due diligence, as well as the topic of human rights, are becoming very relevant for companies as they engage themselves in discussion. Okay, with that, I hope you have selected the right channel and hope you enjoy the webinar. So I want to take a moment to introduce our partner, BSR, Business for Social Responsibility, and we will invite Jeremy later on to explain to us further about the organization. So BSR offers consulting services for sustainability and business and human rights as a global nonprofit organization with offices in North America, Europe, and Asia. They're working with companies such as Facebook, Microsoft, Google, Nike, Danone, and some 300 members, many member companies around the world. So they're providing consulting practices as well as human rights assessments and due diligence. And notably in 2018, including the impact assessment conducted in Samsung Electronics' Vietnamese plant, BSR has delivered human rights impact assessments to over 200 times. So the detailed explanation about BSR will be provided by our partner, BSR Asia Pacific Regional Vice President, Mr. Jeremy PREPSCIUS. Jeremy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to briefly describe BSR. My name is Jeremy PREPSCIUS, and I'm the Regional Vice President for BSR, and I'm based in Hong Kong, where I've been working for about the past 15 years. So what is BSR? In short, we're an organization of sustainable business experts that works with its global network to build a just and sustainable world. As mentioned, we have offices in Europe, Asia, North America, and we're almost 30 years old. We work with our members and their supply chains. Our members are mostly global MNCs, which recognize the importance of sustainability and are investing in their sustainability challenges. Our members work with us for many reasons, but primarily because we have the diverse insights and experience to meet the needs of the broad set of sustainability challenges facing our members globally. As noted, we support our members via insight, our consulting, and our collaboration efforts. So what do we do? Well, we work on 5 whats and 2 hows. The whats of what we work on are the areas we are focusing on: impact, human rights, climate change, an inclusive economy, diversity, equity, inclusion, and women's empowerment. The hows are how companies like you can action these via their strategies, which is sustainability management, and via their supply chains. In terms of human rights, we've been working for 25 years to help companies turn human rights principles into action. We build these actions based on our industry expertise. We take a systemic approach and collaborate and seek insights broadly. As mentioned, we have conducted more than 200 human rights impact assessments and implementation plans, from high-level corporate analyses to in-depth field studies. Some examples of the types of work are listed here, and you'll see our experiences are with a broad and diverse set of corporates. Collaboration is very important to our mission. This means working with groups of companies on shared challenges. Our collaborations are listed here and are important as the global sustainability challenges cannot be solved by individual companies alone and require industry and broader collaborative approaches. Thank you. And I certainly welcome more questions about BSR or membership in our Q&A section. Thank you very much.
네, BSR에 관한 소개를 잘
So thank you very much for your introduction about BSR. So let me take a moment to explain to you JIPYONG LLC. So for the first time as a law firm, we have set up an ESG center, and I'm the head of that center. So 2 years ago, ESG issue has become very important, and we also set up a business and human rights team for the first time in Korea. So we're very much involved in human rights and business, and we also look at the intersections between those two factors. Personally, for the last 3 years or so, I'm also working as a non-standing member of the NHRCK, National Human Rights Commission of Korea. And in that process, we look at the human rights issues of companies, especially dealing with a lot of petitions regarding the human rights infringements. And as we see the trend for ESG management, we see that a lot of companies are now taking interest in that issue, and it is becoming all the more important and relevant, and also becoming a concern as they have a lot of partnerships with suppliers across the supply chain. So in order to come up with an in-depth view and insights in this issue, we decided to take this action. So we're involved and with this in these activities, and we wanted to talk very closely with BSR because it is a very known organization in this field, and we have come to sign an MOU. And through our joint partnership, our two organizations will be helping our companies, for example, establish their human rights related policies and conduct human rights due diligence at their work sites. The slide here shows global presence of BSR across continents, and JIPYONG has the largest number of branch offices across the country as well. So we'll be utilizing our 19 branch offices across the world to perform human rights due diligence, especially in a more systematic manner. Now with that, we're going to begin our webinar in earnest. During this webinar, we'll be having 3 presentations by 3 speakers. To kick off our event, we're going to invite partner attorney Chang from JIPYONG to give a presentation on mandatory human rights due diligence trends in Korea and abroad.
안녕하세요. 반갑습니다. 법무법인 지평의 민창욱
Good
변호사입니다.
afternoon. This is attorney at law Min Chang-woo of the law firm of JIPYONG. I will give you the first presentation on mandatory human rights due diligence trends in Korea and outside. Now, looking back at last year, ESG was a big topic, but there are differences in the ESG perspective and businesses and human rights, or BHR perspective. Now, in ESG, when a non-financial issue occurs, the focus appears to be on its potential impact on the enterprise value. In comparison, in BHR, it's more about the impact on the stakeholders. For example, let's say a very competent CEO was harassing a new recruit right out of college. Then from the ESG perspective, such workplace harassment, this could be an owner risk or a CEO risk or a bullying risk. Then this could hit the company's reputation, the stock price could fall, leading the consumers to shun them. But then for the BHR perspective, it will look at the stakeholders' perspective, so the employee's perspective. Now, for a young employee right out of college, workplace harassment could be painful and scarring for life. So BHR is about how to reduce corporate activities' adverse impact on individual stakeholders. Now, the principles of the BHR are based on the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, or the UNGPs, unanimously endorsed by the UN Human Rights Council in June 2011. Now, as you all know, the UNGPs consist of 3 frameworks: protect, respect, and remedy. Its significance is found in that it has separated between the state's duty to protect human rights by enacting laws and the corporate responsibility to respect human rights of others. What this means is that a global company, no matter their place of business in developed or developing countries, are all responsible for respecting the human rights list endorsed by the international community. And they also should make sure that they can respond accordingly in the event that it is involved in human rights violation. Now, namely, the UNGPs call for businesses to declare their human rights policy, conduct human rights due diligence, and to provide remedies. Now, here, an important concept is due diligence. Normally, when a company is acquiring another company, it would perform due diligence to identify any risks. Similarly, UNGPs call for human rights due diligence to identify human rights risks. Now, the human rights due diligence is an iterative process of the following 4 steps. Now, first, it is a process of discovering and evaluating all potential adverse impact on human rights caused by their own activities or as a result of their business relationships. So the UNGP defines them, all of them, as human rights risks. Now, such adverse impact can occur, or such risks can occur out of their own activities or through their supply chain. And then next, the findings of the impact assessment must integrate into the company's decision-making structure. So this is for the internal integration. And then the stakeholders' feedback must be followed up so as to verify the appropriateness of the actions, which is to verify. And such relevant information must be disclosed and communicated to stakeholders. Now, one issue here is the scope of the corporate responsibility to respect human rights. So this can also be a question of the extent of the company's involvement in human rights violation. So one case is where the company directly caused the violation. So the aforementioned example of workplace harassment is one example here. But another case is where the company contributed to a third party's violation, or so for example, the company might be involved in a third party's violation. So in this case, the company might have contributed to the third party's violation or is directly linked to the violation. So in such a case as well, then the company must take action to make sure that this can be mitigated. Now let me give you an example, and this is the case of the collapse of a large garment factory in Bangladesh, killing around 1,130 employees. Now, at this plant, there were global clothing companies suppliers like Benetton or the Mango. So suppliers to these global companies were housed here, and then the employees were working here. Now, of course, the party that directly caused this human rights violation may be the plant owner or the contractors who demanded work continuation despite the dangerous conditions. Now then, in this case, can it be said that Benetton was responsible in this case? Now, it would depend on the specifics. So if Benetton knew about the adverse environment, but turned a blind eye, and more specifically, now there were reports of the concrete pillar cracking a few days before the collapse. But so let's say if they had been privy to this information, but still turned a blind eye and kept giving out their orders, then perhaps it can be deemed as contributing to the contractor's violation. Now, many companies have been practicing BHR or due diligence since the UNGPs, and the UNGP also recommend engaging experts in the due diligence. And the reason is identifying and discovering potential human rights risks require expertise. So BSR is also providing assistance to many different companies all over the world in the practice of their human rights due diligence. And now more recently, we see that the legislations are now emerging in different parts of the world under the UNGP. Now there are different types under the in terms of the legislation. So the first type is legislations that mandate due diligence on specific areas of human rights, such as forced labor, child labor, and conflict minerals. The second type mandates comprehensive due diligence on the human rights list. So one example is the German Act on supply chain due diligence. So as you can see here on the left-hand side, it also has a specific list of the types of areas that the due diligence must be performed on. So as you can see here, like child labor, forced labor, freedom of association, overdue wages, safety and health, and the environment. And then now it mandates the companies to come up with a system to manage the risk, designate internal managers, and also analyze the risks regularly. So this is about the impact assessment, and then also to implement related remedies. So these are the obligations that are imposed on the companies. And violation of the due diligence obligation may be subject to a penalty of up to 2% of the company's total revenue. And also in this case, the scope of the due diligence includes both the direct suppliers and the indirect suppliers. But then initially, the due diligence is applicable only to the direct suppliers. And then for the indirect suppliers, now they will become subject to due diligence only when human rights risks under this law have been perceived. Then they should also be subject to regular due diligence. Now, next is the due diligence mandate decided at the EU Parliament in March last year. Now, this law applies not only to large companies, but also to listed and high-risk SMEs. Now, when you look at the scope of the due diligence, then it is almost in full compliance with the principles of the UNGPs. So companies are required to discover and evaluate negative impacts on environment and governance, as well as human rights. So this is the impact assessment. And then prevent, discontinue, or mitigate. So this is about the internal integration. Monitor the effectiveness of related measures. That is about the feedback part. And then to report and explain them. So that is about communication. And remedies for human rights risk should be implemented. And one thing of note is that it also guarantees stakeholders' right to participate in the due diligence, especially the labor union. And also, not only so, it also says that companies are liable for damages for the adverse impact caused by or contributed to by the company. But exemption would be granted if the legal obligation for due diligence has been fulfilled. Now, interestingly, the UNGP's principles are also being reflected not only in the due diligence, but also in the ESG-related legislation. So the EU released a draft corporate sustainability reporting guidelines early last year, requiring companies to disclose impact materiality in addition to financial materiality related to sustainability and non-financial issues. And as you can see here on the left-hand side, it also talks about impact caused, contributed to, or directly linked. And then also, the EU released a draft report on taxonomy in July last year to classify socially sustainable economic activities. And the key basis for this taxonomy is the UNGPs. Next, now it happened late last year, so just a few weeks ago in Korea, the framework law on human rights policy passed the cabinet meeting at the end of last year. So not the parliament, but the cabinet meeting. And then now Chapter 5 includes business and human rights, and it also specifies the principle that companies should not engage in or contribute to human rights violations, not only through their own activities, but also through their business relations, that is third parties. And then given that the Framework Act, and then also according to some of the provisions, now we believe that the detailed guidelines and the disclosure standards are to follow. Now, a company's stakeholders in the end are people. Supply chain is about the people. So what is important is, the beginning of the stakeholder capitalism is for companies to respect human rights and to make sure that bad things do not happen to the people. All right, thank you very much, Attorney Min. Thank you very much for the presentation. So he talked about how the idea of the human rights due diligence began, and especially under the UN, how the HRDD is being legislated in other parts of the world. And he also talked about the Korea's Framework Act in this area. So thank you very much for that.
쿠스비안토르.
Next, we're going to invite Associate Director Rosa KUSBIANTORO for the presentation on human rights due diligence framework and case studies from BSR. Please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. And good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rosa KUSBIANTORO. I'm an associate director for BSR based in Singapore. And I've been working with our member companies on various human rights issues for the past 10 years. And it is a real privilege to be able to share some of our work and learnings with you today. I'm looking forward to an interactive discussion with you. But today, we'd like to go over a couple of topics. We'll start briefly with an overview of the evolution of human rights and touch on the UNGP's framework, followed by an overview of BSR's human rights impact methodology, and a case study on how we have applied our methodology to support the human rights efforts of the companies we work with. We often start our discussions on human rights with a basic introduction and set of definitions, but I understand that today's participants are well-versed and experienced in human rights, so we will not go over this slide in detail. There are, however, a few trends in the evolution and focus of human rights and how it may impact businesses, which we would like to highlight. The first is a growing interest and focus on the intersection of climate and human rights, as well as the right to a healthy environment. The third is a persistently greater focus on indigenous rights. And the last is a greater focus on water and sanitation. And to sum up, we believe we are entering a phase of innovation in rights-based approaches. And we anticipate the integration of previously separate topics into a holistic human rights approach encompassing good corporate governance, diversity, equity, inclusion, and also climate resilience. But having said that, the UN Guiding Principles, which was just described previously by our colleague from JIPYONG, will continue to serve as the underlying framework for businesses to demonstrate how they're respecting the human rights of their rights holders. And just a brief reminder that many countries, have developed national action plans and legislation to implement the UNGPs, as highlighted earlier. And we anticipate at BSR that this trend will continue to evolve towards mandatory requirements for all-inclusive human rights due diligence, rather than a topic-by-topic mandatory approach. And now we would like to focus on the human rights due diligence aspect of the UNGPs. So basically, also as previously explained, the UNGPs does lay out the expectation that companies should avoid infringing on the human rights of others and should address adverse impacts with which they are involved. To achieve this, businesses should carry out human rights due diligence. And the human rights impact assessment is the first step in this process. So there are a few elements which we would like to re-emphasize, which are very important to keep in mind. We'd like to highlight 2 points in particular. The first is that the assessment will focus on the impacts on people, such as a company's employees and local communities, instead of the risk to the company's reputation or other financial and legal risks. And the second is that the assessment will assess impacts against all internationally recognized human rights. In cases where the national law is weaker, the assessment will choose and use the higher human rights standard. And this is where, for example, there may be differences from some audits that you're already performing. For example, RBA audits, which typically mandate compliance with national regulations. I believe we received a pre-question on this, and we're happy to discuss this further during the Q&A session. BSR's human rights methodology consists of a few elements, which include desktop research on the country and industry context, internal document review of the company's management policies and systems, interviews with internal and external rights holders, and also analysis based on our experience conducting assessments for other companies in the same sector or country. Another key element of HRIAs, which we want to highlight, is prioritization. Now, all companies have various risks which they need to address with a limited set of resources. And prioritization will help identify the most relevant and urgent risks that companies need to address as a priority. There are two main things which we look at under prioritization. The first is salience of risk, which indicates how serious and likely a potential impact would be on a rights holder. This is determined by scope, for example, how many people could be impacted. Also by scale, how serious is the impact? Does it involve late payment of wages or would it lead to death? Remediability is relatively easy to compensate someone who receives late payment of wages, but compensation to family members over a death is not considered as remediable. And likelihood, how likely is the impact to occur, taking into account the country and sector context? And the second factor we look at is the relevance for business action. So we look at attribution, and as described previously, is the company directly linked to the impact? Or did they cause the impact? Leverage, what is the ability for the company to affect change? And we also look at how well the issue is being managed by the company to determine the residual or remaining risk after management is taken into account. And this is where it is critical to highlight again the importance of strong engagement with the company's rights holders. So as we know, many companies have excellent management policies and systems on paper. However, they may not be implemented as they should on the ground. So it is important for us to talk directly with employees, community members, to understand how these policies are being implemented on the ground, to understand if there are any gaps. We can identify which areas have the greatest gaps, which can be fixed and addressed by the company. These are a couple of examples of the output of a human rights impact assessment report, which show the different types of risks which are relevant for a company. And also examples of the prioritization of the risks. The tier 1 risks are those which are most urgent for the company to address. Tier 3 risks are also important. We have a bit more flexibility. If an issue is not relevant for a company, it would not even be included in this chart. Ultimately, what is important are the actions that the company decides to take to manage the tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 risks identified. And based on our experience, these are often multi-year plans. And to help bring this to life, we would like to share a case study on human rights impact assessments that we have conducted for BSR member companies in Southeast Asia. And we would like to focus on modern slavery, which has been a key focus of governments in countries such as the UK, the United States, and also Australia. As a bit of background, in the Asia Pacific region, it has been estimated that almost 25 million men, women, and children are living in modern slavery. This means 4 out of every 1,000 people living in the region are estimated to be involved in some form of forced labor. And this is the highest prevalence rate compared to other regions globally. The Global Slavery Index, which is published by the Walk Free Foundation in Australia, measures the strength of government response in this topic. Asia Pacific scored an average CCC rating on government response, which is considered very weak. And this weak regional government response is one of the reasons behind why there is so much emergence of stronger mandatory human rights due diligence requirements from countries outside of the region, and also why there is greater expectation placed directly on companies themselves. For example, governments such as the United States are taking firmer action. We have seen this in the form of withhold release orders issued by the US Customs and Border Protection Agency against products allegedly produced using forced labor in the region. And in response, these are a few areas where we are seeing increased activities from companies. BSR in particular, we've been involved quite extensively in the assessment of migrant worker policies and practices. The high prevalence of migrant workers in the region, in combination with weak government regulations and response, has created high risks in this area for many companies. We have conducted assessments to help companies make informed decisions about actions they can take both in the short and long term to protect the rights of migrant workers in their operations and also across their supply chains. It is important for the assessment to cover a migrant worker's full employment life cycle, as there are different types of risks that are present throughout all of these stages. And this is an example of what an HRI may look like in practice. So we have conducted assessments of supply chain partners, including for Korean companies, for their partners in Southeast Asia. In addition to desktop research and internal document reviews, what's important is we do usually take at least a 1 week field visit. Of course, this is prior to COVID. And for a particular assessment, as an example, we interviewed on the site 125 employees, as well as 2 local suppliers who are key for that company, also local civil society and government stakeholders. We also interviewed management team members from the corporate headquarters in Korea, as well as international organizations who are relevant, were interviewed remotely by phone. And these slides show examples of the type of information that we gather from multiple rights holders during our assessments. For example, in relation to working conditions, also in relation to forced labor, as well as child labor. And the slides also contain examples of resources which we refer to during our human rights impact assessments. And it's important for the findings of the assessment to be framed against the UNGP's expectations. Since we have a limited amount of time, we'll only go briefly over 3 aspects. Unfortunately, we cannot share detailed findings of the assessment since they are confidential. However, this slide does show high-level examples of human rights impact assessment findings based on the different nature of activities that take place within a company. And one key aspect which is important to highlight is that human rights management is often the responsibility of multiple functions across the company. Different management actions will need to be owned and executed by different functions. And the final element we want to highlight is the importance of sharing your human rights management and performance with external stakeholders. We often hear from external stakeholders such as banks and other financial institutions that they would rather hear about problems that the company is facing and what plans they have to deal with the issues rather than zero information at all. And this can be done as part of our annual sustainability reporting or as a standalone report. And this slide contains some tips on what constitutes good reporting, and we're happy to share more resources with you if helpful. This concludes my presentation. I look forward to hearing any questions or insights that you would like to share. And again, I understand that some pre-questions have already been shared by some participants, and we're happy to discuss during the Q&A session. Thank you.
네, 로사 부디 디렉터의 발표를 잘 들었습니다.
All right, thank you. So that was Rosa. So she was talking about how the BSR has the framework for the impact assessment and also the prioritization. And she also cited some specific examples of, for example, how the issue of the forced labor is being resolved, and also the impact assessment, how it is specifically performed. So thank you very much for the very detailed explanation. And then we'll move on to the next presentation to be delivered by Jeremy, who will tell us about the supply chain sustainability and human rights risk management.
Thank you for the opportunity to share today about supply chain sustainability and human rights risk management. Now, as I go through this presentation, I'm sure you will hear themes already addressed by our 2 previous speakers. And as time is limited, I'm going to go quickly and stay at a high level. I'm not going to explicate every detail on each slide, but I'm happy to address all questions in the Q&A period. And of course, we're happy to follow up with you directly after this call. Again, thank you to JIPYONG for enabling this presentation, and thank you for your kind attention. Today, I'd like to focus my comments on 3 questions. What is supply chain sustainability? How should companies build systems and solutions? And where can companies find the ROI, the return on investment for this work? This way, I hope we have a shared understanding of what we're talking about, a beginning of how to address the topic, and how this could create value for your company. So let's start with the first question. What is supply chain sustainability? Well, let's start with a simple definition. I think everyone on this call knows what a supply chain is. And let's put ourselves in the seat of the buyer. The supply chain is what your company activates through its purchasing decisions. Supply chain sustainability refers to the effective management of ethical, social, and environmental impacts created and caused through the extension of the supplier network. Impacts that are related to the purchasing decision your company makes. This includes not only suppliers from whom you purchase directly, but those below them in your tier 2 and tier 3 and beyond. So what are some of the ethical, social, and environmental impacts? Well, here are just a few, and we'll talk about others later and have talked about many already. In short, how your supply chain treats its employees, respects the community and environment it operates in, and meets its legal and ethical obligations. Let's also be clear from the very beginning. Supply chain sustainability is about how these considerations are integrated into your procurement processes and directly related to your supply chain strategy and relationships, and your quality, price, and delivery expectations. All are interrelated. Okay, so you might ask, okay, but what does this mean? I understand I want to avoid bad things in my supply chain, but actually avoiding bad, not getting in an accident, isn't actually a strategy. Where are you going to? That's more interesting and the more important question. What does good look like as we think about sustainable supply chains? Well, for BSR, this means supply chains that are efficient, equitable, transparent, and sustainable. Okay, so what is driving this push towards sustainable supply chains? First, let's start with the obvious. COVID's impact has exposed how efficiency in global supply chains has come at the cost of resilience and sustainability. This has underscored how many companies have allowed lowest cost to blind them to risk, resilience, and the other impacts of their supply chain. Second, there's been a steadily greater coverage of sustainability, greater transparency about global supply chains, and greater clarity on the impact of the supply chains, as you've already heard. Third, as you've heard from Rosa, the business and human rights landscape is developing and building expectations for corporate understanding of their human rights impacts. In other words, how companies and their supply chains impact people and their human rights. Supply chain human rights impacts are fundamental to understanding of your supply chain sustainability aspects. The focus on human rights is causing an evolution of national requirements, as you've heard, for human rights due diligence, which is both about your company and its supply chain and requires you to increasingly understand the detailed operations which your supply chain partners exhibit. Even more specifically, as Rosa has begun to outline, the focus on human rights and modern slavery is impacting laws regarding modern slavery and the due diligence requirements. And in this case, again, we're talking about both your company and its supply chain. To put a sharp point on it, the point being your access to markets. US and Customs and Border Protection states that not only that you have to avoid forced labor, which includes raw materials of your product like cotton or silicone, but that you should be able to demonstrate that the merchandise was not produced with forced labor. In short, there are diverse stakeholders that are pushing for more supply chain transparency, due diligence, and accountability. And that doesn't even include a key question for you on this phone. what are your customers' expectations, both now and in the future? As you look downstream to whom you sell, what will those future expectations be? And what does this mean about how and to whom you sell will be increasingly impacted by how and from whom you buy? Okay, so that's the imperative. Why you should be paying attention to this topic and investing in it. The next question companies usually ask is, okay, how? What do I do? The first part of the answers go back to first principles. Supply chains are fundamentally about relationships. All purchasing decisions require two voluntary parties, and this is important to build into any approach. Second, as you've already heard, there are laws. You're not starting from zero. There are laws, guidance, standards, and norms which have been developed over the past 2 decades. You can and should use this knowledge. The third question is for you. What do you want to achieve? What is your company's ambition? How does your company frame the future? What is important, not just today, but in 5 years? That's actually what BSR's supply chain leadership ladder was created to answer. It's a maturity model for supply chain sustainability, which allows you to take steps up the leadership ladder as you mature your strategy. The question your company needs to answer is, how do you move from building awareness about the issues, like we're doing here today, to actually tackling the issues, mitigating them, and turning your supply chain into a strategic asset? To be clear, this is more than an audit, more than an inspection, and requires organizational alignment to achieve. Your organizational alignment enables levers you can control and processes you can invest in, which allow you to influence and build the supply chain you want to see. These include practices inside your company and directly under control, as well as practices which influence external organizations, including suppliers and their workforce, industry participants, and related stakeholders. The process to get started isn't actually complicated, but does require the ability to assess your current state, prioritize what you think is important, and plan next steps. Building a strategy to achieve your desired outcome needs to be built on transparency. What is your supply chain? Where is it? What are the relevant risks and impacts? From social and human rights risks and impacts to environmental and governance issues and risks and impacts. You need to understand how these pertain to you, and then you need to get work implementing and iterating. Often this leads to 2 key improvement cycles. Both are important to how you manage supply chain sustainability as well as human rights. The first is outwardly focused. How do you create a continuous improvement cycle with your supply chain to achieve your expected outcomes? The second is, how do you build internal management for both human rights and supply chain issues to ensure you have the management systems to implement your expectations, as well as remediation systems to deal with the issues which inevitably arise? Remember that supply chains are fundamentally about relationships. Work to create win-win, integrate these into your purchasing functions, and collaborate to evolve the outcomes you desire. Okay, so you do all this work. Where's the ROI? First, the ROI sits in the supply chain operations itself. You should be able to create increased resilience and decreased risk by explicitly addressing these in your strategy. These have corporate value, and unfortunately, many companies fail to fully account for these values. How are you going to impact your Scope 3 emissions? Well, through this engagement process. Use your increased transparency, efficiency, and accountability to find reputational returns. Second, integrate sustainability into your supply chain finance operations and use these to create win-win opportunities for both your company and your supply chain. We have a report which can be found on the BSR website if you're interested in learning more. Finally, your ROI should be found in brand and product. You can integrate your supply chain investments into your brand. Lou & Gray does via their engagement with her project. And you can use your supply chain practices to demonstrate how trust, ethical behavior, and accountability are fundamental to your value proposition. You can also integrate your supply chain strategy into your product offerings, whether it is how they're described via an online platform, or as H&M does, explicitly link the product to the supply chain and how your company manages that supply chain. Particularly as more retail moves online, I would expect greater consumer ease, clicking a link, to enable greater transparency and product level engagement on ethical supply chains to be key in the future. At the broader level, what we're beginning to clearly see is how you buy, your supply chain practices are influencing what you can sell where and to whom. And in the future, as this becomes increasingly important, it will shift as the expectations in your supply chain move towards dictating what you sell. The market expectations of your products and by your customers will determine how you buy in terms of the expected ethical, social, environmental, and governance practices and expectations in your supply chain. Thank you very much for your time and attention. I look forward to all questions, and thank you very much.
네, 제레미 부대표님의 좋은 발표를 들었습니다. 공급망에서
Thank you
지속한
very much for your wonderful presentation. So the concept of sustainability in supply chain, what does it mean to have human rights? What are the strategies that are required for companies? What are the stakeholders' expectations and how we communicate the expectations and so forth? So we have received some questions prior to this event, and as we were going through the lectures, we would like to encourage participants to please post their questions in the chat room, and we'll try to address them as much as possible. So we're going to have a Q&A and also to have a short discussion.
네, 저희가 사전에 받은 질문 중에서 우선 몇 가지로 좀
So we have some pre-received questions, and we would like to begin with that first. So first question goes.
이제 요즘 뭐
Many Korean companies now, because especially many listed companies are, so for example, like public corporations. So anyway, so these listed companies and many Korean companies are performing human rights due diligence, mostly according to the RBA, Responsible Business Alliance guidelines. But then today we mostly talked about the UNGPs. So the due diligence based on UNGPs. So then, given that the most Korean companies perform due diligence according to the RBA guideline, then should there be other due diligence according to the UNGPs? So then let me ask Jeremy to respond to this question first.
I'm going to give the honor to my esteemed colleague, Rosa, who will take the first shot at this answer, but thank you.
Right, thank you so much for the question. It's a great question, and it is actually something that we also often hear from our member companies. So the RBA is a great standard, and it's a very important first step for companies to complete RBA audits. They have much value. And one thing is, they do also look at the same set of international human standards as the first step. They look at a lot of the relevant human rights risks, which are also covered under human rights impact assessments under the UNGPs. Maybe one slight difference could be important, and this depends on the country in which your supplier or your operation is being assessed. One thing that is often discussed is RBA tends to look at how well a company's operations adheres to the national regulations in regards to various human rights issues. And in countries where the government is strong, the labor laws are strong, all ILO core conventions have been ratified, enforcement is good, this is not an issue. So the RBA audit is considered as quite comprehensive and adhering to the same international human rights expectations that the UNGPs would expect companies to. However, in certain countries where the labor law is weak, where not all ILO labor conventions have been ratified, or where enforcement of certain issues is weak, then that could be an issue. So that is where sometimes additional human rights due diligence is advised. And this sometimes relates to issues such as the right to the freedom of association, collective bargaining. Sometimes it relates to regulations on minimum wage, etc. It really depends on the context. So in some cases, we have actually helped some of our member companies who have already conducted RBA audits to complement this with focused human rights due diligence, again, focusing on certain countries where the labor law is not quite as robust as others. But maybe I'll stop first and ask if Jeremy would like to add on.
I'll add two pieces. And to be clear, I used to work at Nike. And I was around Nike in the late 1990s and early 2000s when a lot of the supply chain compliance work started. And RBA started as a working group inside BSR, actually. I think there's three really interesting pieces that are emerging from human rights and the UN guiding principles processes. Number one, the purpose of the human rights due diligence, particularly on your own company, is about your own ownership and management of those risks to stakeholders. The outcome of a human rights due diligence process could include RBA-style compliance action program elements, but at the end of the day, this is about your company for your needs to implement in your systems based on your footprint. And so the ownership of the human rights due diligence concept should sit with you, not with the RBA. The RBA is a great tool, absolutely no question, but it's about what your company is owning it. And the second one, and this maybe goes back to the very first example that was brought up, was what are the real risks, opportunities, and issues? Harassment for a new hire inside a company. That is mitigatable, that is manageable, that is avoidable with good human resource management systems and processes that are part of how do you think about mitigating human rights issues over the broader term. So in short, this is about your company's ownership and footprint and the ownership and footprint of your company's supply chain accountable to you, not the RBA.
네, 잘 들었습니다.
So thank you very much for your responses. So let's move on to the second question. So when BSR conducts human rights impact assessments, you talked about prioritization and how to identify priority of the risks. So do you happen to use any checklists, maybe for industries or for companies? And also in terms of the stakeholders, how do you perform interviews with them? So there was a question from the participants in advance. So who would like to take the question right now?
Maybe I can start again, and then Jeremy can add on. So again, thank you very much for the questions. Again, very important questions also. So in terms of prioritization, we do have a very long list of the comprehensive list of human rights issues which would be relevant for companies globally. But indeed, as you mentioned, based on the industry, based on the sector, we can quickly shortlist the human rights issues to what is most relevant for that industry. Also, depending on the country in which that particular asset, which is being assessed, is located in, we can also further narrow down the set of human rights risks which we assess. So that's the first step of shortlisting that we look at, and that actually does narrow down usually our initial shortlist, which we come up with after that prioritization is about 20 issues or so. So it's not no long list of 50 issues. No, it actually becomes quite narrow quite quickly, unless you're in a very high risk sector in a very high risk country, then yes, you might have quite a long list of issues which need to be assessed. In terms of how we conduct stakeholder engagement and also assessing, I guess, which stakeholders we need to talk to. So we do our own research. We also talk to the company, and based on our experience, we have a good understanding of who are the international stakeholders that we think are important to interview to get their perspective on what is relevant, what is going to be relevant in the future for that industry, for that country. Also, we try to interview local, stakeholders within that country as well to get a more in-depth perspective on what is really going on the ground in that country. In terms of internal stakeholders, that's where we rely very heavily on the support of the company that we're assessing. So local management is definitely important. We try to identify which local management teams we should interview. Corporate headquarter management is also key, again, just to make sure we understand both the global level policies and the country level policies. In terms of the workers, again, that's super important. We want to make sure that we interview a lot of workers and a good cross-section of the workers. So female workers, male workers, temporary, permanent, etc. If there are migrant workers present, all nationalities, for example, Indonesian, Bangladeshi, Nepali, etc., to make sure we understand the different experiences. And also, of course, local community members, if relevant. We would also interview a different cross-section, women, men, etc. So again, we don't want to also interview everyone. So we're also very selective, and we work together with a company to make sure that we interview the right combination of workers, other stakeholders in a manageable time frame as well. But hopefully that helps to answer some of your questions. And again, I'll ask Jeremy if you want to add anything.
Oh, that's a great answer. Thank you.
네, 고맙습니다. 한국 기업들이 이제 인권 실사를 하는
Alright, thank you. Now then, for the Korean companies, their human right due diligence history is not that long. But then now the Korean National Human Rights Council, they also came up with a checklist for such due diligence. And it has about 10 human rights questions. So for example, whether there is child labor, forced labor, freedom of association, whether it is being granted or not. So really the key questions about the human rights. And now for the most companies in Korea, major companies do not find any issues regarding those key issues. So then for the human rights due diligence, rather than actually identifying the actual issues, it's more about just checking off on the list. So more of a formality, so to speak. Then also there was emphasis on the communication with the stakeholders. And I see that the due diligence is also a conversation, a dialogue between the company and the stakeholders mediated by human rights. So in that process, they can identify human rights issues, can also strengthen their capability to manage human rights issues, and overall improve relations with the stakeholders in that process. But then again, many companies see human rights due diligence as something like a test or exam. So rather than going to in-depth communication with the stakeholders, so they just try to show and they just respond that no, we have no child labor or forced labor, and that is it. So given this backdrop, I do believe that the responses and the presentations so far have been quite useful for the Korean companies. Now, based on that, one more question in relation to this. Now, the Korean companies, they perform the due diligence on their own in many cases.
So, like ESG teams and separate teams would use their checklist to perform the assessment, but BSR, it's a third-party organization that conducts human rights due diligence. What's the rationale for that? Why do we need to have that due diligence? What's the meaning of doing that? Because in the international community, for example, you could do your own company assessments, or you could have a third party conduct the assessments. Are there any differences in terms of the views?
Maybe I can start again and ask Jeremy to add on. So thank you so much. That's a very interesting context and also a very important question. So indeed, a lot of companies do have strong internal human rights teams and expertise. And some of the activities that we do is to help these companies strengthen their internal human rights due diligence system. So that's fine. But there is some benefit and value of having independent human rights impact assessments conducted. And this is particularly in cases, for example, where there have been, say, public issues or conflict, or there are some tensions with external stakeholders, rights holders, or even within the company, for example, if there have been strikes or protests, etc. So sometimes it is valuable to have an independent party conduct these engagements, these interviews, so that we could receive more information from the rights holders about what they think is wrong, about what they think the company has not been doing, if they think that the company has not been listening to them, etc. So sometimes it can be difficult for internal human rights experts to get that same level of frankness or openness compared to an independent third party. And again, we understand also the maybe instinct for companies to tick the box and say no child labor, no forced labor, etc. And again, one of the key things that we want to highlight is indeed a lot of companies have very robust supplier codes of conduct, management systems, etc., which do say zero tolerance of forced labor, child labor, etc. However, more and more expectations are being put forth on companies to demonstrate how they are checking whether or not this is a case, and it's no longer going to be acceptable, I think, just to say there's no forced labor, et cetera. And independent human rights impact assessments can be one credible source of helping to prove that. Having said that, it's still an expectation for the company to conduct due diligence on an ongoing manner. So an independent human rights impact assessment is helpful, but it does need to be supplemented by systems, as Jeremy mentioned. So you still have to have your own internal checking, compliance, and reporting. And again, as asked, reporting is very important to demonstrate that you do understand what your risks are, because even the UNGPs, the expectation is not for companies to have zero risk. That's impossible. The expectations is for the company to demonstrate they have a good system to identify what their risks are in their operations and supply chain, and then develop plans to address those risks over time. So again, it's not a test. There will be risks that keep occurring, and that's fine as long as you can show through your management plans how you are planning to address them over time. So maybe I'll stop first and ask Jeremy if you want to add anything.
I'll add a couple pieces. And real briefly. And one is why we're here with JIPYONG, which is a law firm. If you think about where due diligence is coming from, in many ways, trying to provide answers to sometimes media inquiries, and where it's going to, legal accountability. If you think about a stock exchange, of course, your company has a finance department that does your own books, but you still have somebody else come in and audit you. because the accountability to your shareholders means you have to have good books. So as you think about where is human rights due diligence going, one is growing accountability. Two, for example, if you want to import into the US, to your ability to answer questions to US Customs and Border Protection, if necessary. The second one is reliance. Have you done enough? Are you sure you've took all of the blinders off and you're looking robustly, not only at good systems, but where are the problems? Every company has problems. Every company has an issue. Every company will have something come up. Are you learning from taking those and integrating them, which is sometimes really hard for companies to do, in a way that the same way somebody on your board needs to be accountable as head of the audit committee, imagine someone on your board being accountable externally and to your regulators for your human rights due diligence. That's why as you think about what is robust, what is reliable, and what is the emerging accountability, those tell you where this industry is moving towards.
네, 두 분 말씀 잘 들었습니다.
So thank you very much for your responses. I think we could probably have a full day talking about this because there are a lot of agendas that are rising as we speak and as we have this conversation. Especially you talked about reporting, because human rights due diligence is not about just ticking boxes, but it is about communication with the stakeholders, rights holders, as well as reporting. So Korean companies, when they publish sustainability reports, they would have a portions of that allocated to human rights assessment. And I was able to take a look at an example of a company. They said that they don't have any child labor, forced labor, and so forth, that they have 0 case of infringement on human rights within their company. And I thought to myself, is it really possible, practically possible? Because human rights infringement, there's 0 case of that. Is that something that you could take pride in? Does it really show objectivity of the assessment? Because internally, if you're communicating very effectively on human rights, you probably would have more numbers than that. So especially maybe they're just going through the formalities of reporting this or communicating to external stakeholders and really taking a deep dive on the issues. Now, there aren't any Korean companies that are actually just publishing separate reports on human rights. I think there was only one company that tried it last year, but I hope that there will be more companies joining the queue in the future. So we allocated only about 1 hour for this webinar. I just realized that we're running behind our schedule, but we would like to just delve into the final one last question before we close.
So as we have talked about so far, especially about the Korean companies, now, in the EU, so EU laws, especially regarding the due diligence, especially the supply chain due diligence, so the Korean companies are highly interested in that. And then also the two of you also mentioned the US Customs and Border Protection, and they can also come up with that requirement to demonstrate and so forth. Now then, looking at these trends in the EU and the US, then how are the Korean companies to prepare for such development? So how should they prepare for them? Who wants to go first?
Maybe I'll start this time. And I'll take both of those questions together in a way. If you have I used to work in factories. If you have a factory with no people in it, you can have 0 accidents and injuries. As soon as you put a person in that factory, you will have a risk and a probability of an accident or injury. Everybody in the world reports time loss incidents per million man hours, or a variant on that. Any company that would tell you we've never had an accident or injury, I wouldn't believe. Because human rights, people. And what we're talking about is how people interact and relate and have opinions and sometimes get grumpy and unhappy and sometimes do bad things. So as we're thinking about reporting, what you need to think about it from the perspective of things will always go wrong. Every company gets sued. So therefore, if things will always go wrong and you have to report, what do you want to report? An audit, no problem, or robust management systems? How do banks look at anti-money laundering? It's not because they go through everything and say, look, we found none, we're good. They look at it in 3 lines of control. Do you have robust systems to manage, to functionally engage, to assure that risk? And then even more important, how do you integrate this whole idea of grievance systems, of means of redress, to be able to say, well, of course, we have no perfect management system. When it goes wrong, we have means of finding and making sure we can set it right. So that's my longer answer of we have to think about this from the perspective not of everything's perfect, but the perspective of it's people. Things go wrong. How do we manage through that?
Not sure if we have time to address the second question, or also if our colleagues at JIPYONG would like to.
네, 맞아 말씀하셔도 됩니다, 선생님.
Please go ahead. You can use your
Oh.
time.
Okay, great, thank you. Well, thank you so much, Jeremy. So yeah, I totally agree with your response about the reporting question. In terms of what Korean companies and other companies can do to start preparing for the mandatory human rights due diligence requirements. So I think basically the UNGPs are still the underlying foundation of those requirements. Basically, these countries want to see, do you have the human rights due diligence framework, which was explained by our colleague Chang from JIPYONG, like assess impacts, integrate, track, and then communicate. So you have to have all of those elements. There are specific elements which they do expect, for example, a public commitment to human rights, basically a human rights policy, or having some commitment to that in your code of conduct or ethics, for example. Also, again, the human rights due diligence framework, grievance mechanisms, as Jeremy mentioned, and also access to remedy. That's another key element that they will look at. Do you have an operational grievance mechanism? Are you tracking how effective it is? Are you also tracking and reporting how, you're investigating the complaints, grievances that you received? Of course, we understand not every complaint is valid. Some of them will not be valid. But for those that you find are true or valid, what action did you take to provide remedy? The UNGPs also has criteria which demonstrates this is acceptable remedy. So again, are you also reporting on that? And basically, there are 2 elements. I think due diligence is important, and just showing that duty of care, making sure that you're doing what is appropriate in that particular situation. So those are some of the key, expectations. We do have some resources on this, which we can share through our colleagues at JIPYONG after this presentation. We actually also do have EU mandatory human rights due diligence preparatory checklist. I think that's only for BSR members, however, but we do have resources which we can share publicly, which are a bit longer, but again, you can extract from that what you think is relevant for you to help prepare for the upcoming due diligence regulations. Yeah.
네. 우리 민창욱 변호사님도
All right, now then also Attorney Min. So, the EU or the global legislation trends, if you could also give your input? Right. So in Germany, so the law is already enacted, so it will go into effect soon, starting in 2023, I believe. But then now, actually, the EU law now it is still pending with some discussions underway. But then now for Korean companies that are exporting to the EU, so if they are part of the EU supply chain, then they would be required to conduct due diligence. And actually, even without the law, in the EU, there are a lot of laws that require disclosure of non-financial information, which also includes the supply chain. So, for example, in terms of the impact, so I believe that you could also make some preparation for that. And then also in the case of Korea, the Framework Act on Human Rights Policy, it is still a Framework Act, but then it is also likely to be followed up with the enforcement decree or some like implementation plans. So I believe that we can also keep up with those changes in Korea as well. All right, thank you. So now we have gone much over time than scheduled. So I believe that it is time for us to wrap up. Now, together with BSR, we have discussed the issue of the human rights due diligence, especially supply chain sustainability. So I truly appreciated this opportunity. Now, of course, in Korea, the business and human rights issues, perhaps we are now only beginning. So for us to think about them, to discuss them, and for the companies to really embrace them as their own issues. So it might take some time, but human rights basically are about respecting, valuing people. So companies, any company that values people will be the company that I want to work for. And if I'm a consumer, then will be the company from whom I want to buy from. So when the human rights issues become business issues, then this will make the businesses more sustainable. And regarding this point, we were able to gain a lot of insight and inspiration. So thank you very much to all the participants. So thank you very much for your participation and your interest. And I do hope that this can be a trigger to more substantive discussion in Korea to follow. And with that, we conclude this webinar co-hosted with BSR.
프레젠테이션 마치겠습니다. 감사합니다.